Welcome back to AoS Explained. In this episode, we will cover what hammers are in Age of Sigmar. Be sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me know in the comments what topic you want me to cover next. So, let's start by defining a hammer. Liberators have hammers. Does that make them a hammer? What about steel helms? They have hammers. Are they a hammer unit? Well, in short, no. Hammer units are not necessarily units that wield hammers, but instead are units that can output a large amount of damage and can destroy key units in your opponent's army. The hammer archetype can also be classified further into the following subclasses: bruisers, scalpels, and glass cannons. We will cover each subclass and some examples for each, starting with bruisers. Bruisers are probably the easiest hammer archetype to understand and also the most common hammer across competitive armies. Bruisers are loosely defined by having the ability to absorb a hit and still be able to deliver lethal damage to the unit that charged them. These units also can benefit from not needing to activate first, since they have the toughness to withstand the damage from the unit they charged. Bruisers are also often slow on their own, but can be given more tools to extend their threat range. Some examples of bruiser units are Cities of Sigmar Hammerers, Slaves to Darkness Chosen, and Ogre Maw Tribe's Gluttons. Now, each of these examples have wildly different profiles, so let's walk through how each unit falls under the bruiser subclass. Hammers find their strength in a 3-up save and a 5-up ward order, which also gives them a -1 to be hit. Chosen have 3 health apiece and also a 3-up save, and can get a ward from the Eye of the Gods, but they find their strength in the ability to double fight with crit mortal weapons. This grants them the ability to lose a couple of models and still do plenty of damage over 2 fight abilities. Gluttons possess an abysmal 5-up save, but are 4 health a model, and a reinforced unit has 12 models. They can easily get a bonus to attack from their spell lore, and can lose a few models and still deliver lethal damage. All 3 of these units also have damage to weapons, which is very common among hammer units, regardless of subclass. Scalpels are a very refined hammer, focused on eliminating a specific class of unit in a precise manner. Usually, these hammers are often equipped with an anti-X weapon that gives them a conditional buff against their preferred unit. Scalpels often will also have a very high movement characteristic or the ability to deep strike, supported by other units or army rules to shorten the charge roll needed to make a successful charge. Some ranged hammers also fall under this archetype, making up for the lack of movement in the distance they can threaten from. Stormcast Eternals have some great examples of scalpels in Age of Sigmar 4th edition. Long strikes have been a constant in Stormcast, providing high damage against singular units, excelling at eliminating hero monsters and other high-value units from a long distance. Vanguard Paladors can run and charge, boasting a vicious 20-inch movement before charging on a max roll, which can allow them to bypass screens and access whatever combat they wish to. Finally, Annihilators with Meteoric Grand Hammers boast an incredible damage profile, but only move 4 inches on the ground. However, they are very powerful when delivered in Deep Strike, which Stormcast excel in. Glass cannons are often the hardest hammer to pilot in competitive play. They often require diligent screening and comprehension of your opponent's game plan and threat ranges to stay safe, since they can die to a stiff breeze. Glass cannons are commonly point efficient and can trade up effectively as long as they get to fight first. They are also very vulnerable to shooting and any damage dealt outside of the combat phase. Skaven's Rat Ogres, Cities of Sigmar's Executioners, and Caradron Overlord's Skywardens all fall under the Glass Cannon archetype. Rat Ogres boast a terrible 5-up save and only 24 wounds in a reinforced unit, but with army rule support can reach 8 damage to attacks per model, threatening massive damage against any unit. Executioners are the definition of being able to die to a stiff breeze, but a reinforced unit can put up 60 damage 1 attacks with crit mortals on 5-ups for only 300 points. Skywardens can travel safely with the boats, boasting damage 2 attacks with crit mortal, but only have 12 health in a unit of 6. Now that we know what kinds of hammers we can bring to the battle, how should we use them? Do I march them up as fast as possible and plant them in the middle of the board and dare my opponent to step up to challenge them? Do I leave them in strategic reserve to protect them as long as possible? It is important to now understand the 2 main concepts when piloting hammers, regardless of which subclass they fall into. These 2 concepts revolve around alpha striking and counterpunching. Let's dive into alpha striking first. Armies with very fast hammers, or the ability to effectively deep strike hammers, possess the ability to use their units to alpha strike your opponent. To alpha strike, you must be able to actively and effectively threaten your opponent from the beginning of turn 1. This can force your opponent to play more defensively, taking less space in order to protect their valuable units. This grants you more space, while still being able to threaten your opponent's game plan. Alpha Strike armies also have a great natural advantage against opponents that are not running screens. Some armies that either do not really have access to screens or simply choose not to bring them really suffer against the Alpha Strike armies that are able to go first and cripple the game plan of the opponent. The other main way to effectively utilize hammers is by counterpunching. This involves using screens and other units to protect your hammers, and then charging in on your turn to counter your opponent. This is the primary style of play among armies that lack the ability to Alpha Strike. This is also more difficult to manage, as you have to be very aware of your screening units and your hammers and the threat range of your opponent. Now we know the 3 main subclasses of hammers, and the 2 main ways we can use them. So let's talk list building. How many hammers should you take? Are you just jamming as many reinforced units of Varanguards into a list as possible with a foot hero to lead the regiment? Are you taking 4 cheap glass cannons because you are positive that you have mastered the positional play required and can always ensure you're trading up? Before we jump to the theoretical maximum on how much damage all 80 executioners can do, let's look at the 2 main ways to play hammers to guide our list building. Building an Alpha Strike list has a couple of components to focus on during list building. 1. You want to have as few drops as possible to determine the turn order, and 2. You want to bring hammer units that can reliably charge your opponent on turn 1. An example of this is the Stormcast Eternals list that was built around Krondys, Vanguard Raptors, and Vanguard Paladors. These units had the ability to reliably inflict serious damage on turn 1, or purposefully go second to try and get the double turn, effectively winning the game at the top of turn 2. These lists focus primarily on bringing scalpels to cripple an opponent's game plan, while occasionally bringing a bruising unit that can survive the opponent's turn after the Alpha Strike. A list focusing on using counterpunching hammers is considered the more traditional army composition. When it comes to building these more traditional lists, I would never only bring 1 hammer unit. There are very few armies in the game that can effectively play with only a single hammer unit, since their game plan may not entirely revolve around combat damage. I would always bring at least 2 hammers in any case, sometimes taking 3 depending on cost and how well my cheaper hammers trade up. We are currently in a meta where all of your units should either be stupidly tanky or deal some kind of respectable damage. In any case, if your army's game plan relies on dealing combat damage and destroying enemy units, bring multiple hammers. You would be surprised how quickly your bruiser unit can fold under the right circumstances. Hammers in Age of Sigmar 4th edition are the name of the game. This edition is even more lethal than 3rd, and calls for most armies to be running multiple high combat damage units to threaten your opponent and control the flow of the game. I would never leave home without them, and I recommend bringing a variety of hammers if your army allows. Being able to spread the focus of your damage to multiple places across the battlefield adds depth to your strategy and makes it harder for your opponent to predict what you're going to do. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to turn on notifications so you know when the next AoS Explained video is released. The next video in the series will cover the Anvil role, played by units in Warhammer, Age of Sigmar.